Russian President Vladimir Putin appears to have stepped up the nuclear rhetoric. This as he announced that Russia had successfully tested a potent new strategic missile and declined to rule out the possibility that it could carry out weapons tests involving nuclear explosions for the first time in more than 3 decades. This was accompanied by a warning. Putin reiterated that no one in their right mind would use nuclear weapons against Moscow, saying that, and I'm quoting here, if such an attack was detected, he said, such a number of our missiles, hundreds would appear in the air that not a single enemy would have a chance of survival. As the war rages on, what do these latest comments mean for Russia's war in Ukraine? To discuss this, we have with us Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability at Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So how do you assess the warning by Putin on nuclear threats to Russia?
Look, Russia has consistently tried to use nuclear threats as an intimidation tactic against the West since the beginning of the war. It basically rattles nuclear sabers to try and constrain NATO's willingness to support Ukraine. And I think what's happening is that Putin is sensing in the West, particularly as a result of the current leadership issues within the US Congress over the GOP, and also the potential risk of a return of President Trump, that maybe there is an easing of determination in the US about supporting Ukraine. So he's rattling up these nuclear sabers. He's raising the tensions to try and increase the risk that the US and its European allies will back off from supporting Ukraine.
Right, absolutely. In fact, I was just going to come to this. And just for better clarity here, would you see this as a sign of escalation, or do you reckon that this is mere intimidation?
I think it's intimidation, but if he does go ahead and actually test a nuclear weapon, if he pulls out of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and then tests a nuclear weapon, I think that would be considered escalation. It's not a use of a tactical nuclear weapon in an operational sense, but it is a warning sign that Russia would be prepared to potentially use nuclear weapons. So I would imagine that if he does test a nuclear weapon, then the US and its allies in Europe would have to respond, not in a military sense, but certainly in a very strong political and economic sense. And they would have to, I think, suddenly take seriously the prospect that Russia could then escalate to the use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Right, and that being said, Putin said that Russia had successfully tested a potent new strategic missile. As I mentioned, he declined to rule out the possibility that it would carry out weapons tests involving nuclear explosions. And what's your take on this? Would you say that, what would you say would be the implications of this on the war in Ukraine?
Well, look, I think the testing of the nuclear-powered cruise missile, the Brezhnev weapon, is something that essentially we're all watching. It's a nuclear-powered cruise missile that basically has unlimited range, so that if Russia deployed these things in an operational sense, the Russians could launch large numbers of these cruise missiles into the air and keep them in the air for long periods of time, and that would complicate Western air defenses. I think the actual prospect of a Russian nuclear test, if he does that, as I said, would increase the potential concern that Russia could, at some point in the future, escalate through the nuclear threshold, perhaps by using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. I don't think that's likely to happen this year. I think the greatest risk of escalation across the nuclear threshold by Russia would only occur if Ukraine is clearly going to win the war. And that window of opportunity for Ukraine to take back its territory, including Crimea, probably won't emerge until the second half of next year. So the risk goes up that at that point that Russia could escalate past the nuclear threshold.
Right. And Dr. Davis, Putin also spoke about why he did not attend the BRICS summit, saying that he did not want it to become a political show. What's your opinion on this?
Well, look, he didn't attend because he didn't want to be arrested. He's under threat of being arrested as a war criminal and taken to The Hague. And I think that he has his own self-preservation at stake rather than any other excuse. So I think that his concern was to avoid being arrested. And basically, it does limit where he can go now. He's under threat of being arrested and hauled before The Hague as a war criminal, and rightly so. And so I think that his days of traveling around the world are gone. They're finished.
All right. Well, that being said, what's your assessment of Russia's position in the international realm at the moment? Where do you see this war heading? This, as Ukraine, it's likely in for another tough winter.
Look, I think the Ukrainians will continue to fight. They're not going to accept any sort of negotiated settlement that would see them having to cede not only their territory but also their people to Russia. So I don't see a negotiated peace settlement occurring anytime soon, and I don't think Russia is interested in peace either. The war continues into 2024. The counteroffensive by the Ukrainians will continue through the winter and into the northern spring, when it will gather pace again. And the question then really becomes is whether the US and Europe are continuing to support Ukraine with military support, or has internal political wrangling in the US and lack of munitions in NATO actually constrained that support. If that support drops off from the West, then Russia potentially has the opportunity to turn this war around and potentially achieve some sort of success. Then the real risk would be that would embolden Putin, giving him an incentive to rearm and then start the war again, essentially to take more of Ukraine or to threaten NATO. And I think that the real risk then is that we face a much wider war at that point.
All right. Dr. Malcolm Davis, thank you so much for joining us on WION with your insights on this.
Thank you.